Hi, folks, and welcome to Afrocentricity. I am your host, Michael Washington. Our program today is a 90-minute forum, a panel discussion on white privilege laws and white supremacy laws. The organizer and moderator of our panel is internationally sought after as an artist, a poet, a community organizer, and human rights activist. His sculptures are included in numerous private collections of individuals and churches across the United States, including Pulitzer Prize-winning author Alice Walker, Sheriff Mike Hennessy, Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland, California, and St. Paul Community Baptist Church in Brooklyn, New York. He has performed poetry on stage with the Archie Shepp Quartet at Sweet Basil's nightclub in Greenwich Village, New York, of which I had the honor of attending both nights. He has done poetic cultural performances in Waveland, Mississippi, Harlem, New York, and New Orleans, Louisiana. As a community organizer and human rights activist, he was a co-creator of the Third World Caucus of Clergy and Laity Concern, or CALC, a peace and justice organization that was founded in 1967 by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other clergy in response to the Vietnam War. He is an ordained Baptist minister at the historic Allen Temple Baptist Church. Pardon me? Okay. He is an ordained Baptist minister at the historic Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland, California, pastored by Dr. J. Alfred Smith Jr., where he has innovative programs over 30 years, including Freedom Schools, Emerging Leaders Program, and a prophetic justice ministry. He is a founding organizer, curriculum designer, and former trainer with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, based in New Orleans, Louisiana. The aspects of the curriculum that he designed have been an integral part of the Undoing Racism workshop process since 1980, and is the historical basis for today's topic of discussion. His work for social justice and human rights has taken him to Japan, Mexico, Puerto Rico, South Africa, Switzerland, and Honduras. He represented the Meiklejohn Civil Liberties Institute before the Human Rights Committee, both in New York and Geneva, Switzerland, regarding human rights abuses in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. His pursuit of human rights and justice in the Hurricane Katrina tragedy led to speaking engagements at Stanford University Law School, Boalt College of Law, UC Berkeley, Humboldt State College, Columbia University School of International Social Work, and Fordham University. Without further delay, I present Daniel Allen Buford to introduce our esteemed panelists and to moderate our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. I'm just going to have to hire Dr. Mike as my press agent from now on for that great, generous introduction that he gave to me. I want to welcome everyone onto this broadcast and this Zoom conversation on this important topic, where we're talking about white supremacy laws and white privilege laws that are now being created in order to keep Black people from voting, as well as Latinos, Native Americans, and probably the poor white people who have to be in the voting districts where Blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans live. So then this is a timely topic because in a year and a half, we'll be going to the polls And the things that are going on right now are going to have a direct impact on whether or not people are going to be able to vote and have their vote count. And so what I want to do before introducing our distinguished panel of friends and guests and scholars, etc., I want to set up a little bit of a background before I proceed to introduce these panelists and then pose questions to each of them. And they will all have a few minutes to respond to the questions. And after that, we have one or two people who are on this Zoom call who will be respondents, and I will introduce them at that time. So what brings us here is the need to preemptively talk about the white supremacy laws and white privilege laws that are now being designed and implemented all over the country. What has to be said before we get into the specificity of that topic is that the very fact that we're talking about these laws is a fact of something illegal. That is to say, white supremacy laws are illegal according to the U.S. Constitution, and they're also illegal according to the various human rights treaties that the United States has signed on to and that have been ratified by the U.S. Senate. So I want to start on that point because often when we talk about elections, election violations, etc., we speak of that within the context of U.S. human rights that are civil rights. But notice I'm not talking just about civil rights. Our civil rights are those rights that are derived from the U.S. Constitution and that we all enjoy as citizens of the United States. But even with that, these white supremacy laws, these white privilege laws, are violations of several key articles of the U.S. Constitution. Now, the treaties that the United States has signed and ratified and additional law, and as well as additional law sources, they lay out clear benchmarks for assessing elections and providing remedies if these benchmarks are not achieved. And under Article 6 of our Constitution, treaties ratified by the Senate, like statutes, are part of the law of the land. That means that the United States must comply with them or else violate not only the treaty itself, but also the Constitution that makes that treaty legally binding. In addition, international observers should be present to monitor the upcoming election, just as U.S. observers at times have monitored foreign elections. There's a need for these international monitors in 2022 elections and any subsequent audits and challenges to election results in order to protect the human rights of African Americans and those that are in the voting districts of African Americans. So then very quickly, the specific things that the United States has signed on to. Number one, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 7 has a statement that all are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. All are entitled to equal protection. Any discrimination and violation of this declaration and any incitement to discrimination is prohibited. So then in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it affirms that we have equal protection of the laws, or should have that equal protection of the law. These equal protection issues are also repeated in Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I'm not going to go into in specific, and also repeated in the treaty that is designed from off of these particular clauses in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Article 2 has specific provisions that talk about voter suppression laws, and that it also calls for effective measures and remedies. And let me say that the protection of voting rights should be proactive. It should not happen after those rights have been violated. They are supposed to be proactive, meaning they should be protective and preemptive and prophylactic, if you will, in terms of preventing these things from occurring. Article 4 of the ICCPR is being violated by Texas, having declared an emergency. That specifically calls for people's rights to be protected in the event of a national emergency or a state emergency, as a state of governors. The governor of the state of Texas has called this an emergency. Article 25 calls for voting rights protections, and Article 26 calls for equal protection of the law. These voting rights laws that are being violated by the white supremacy and white privilege laws are in violation of Article 5 of the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, wherein in 1870, African American men were given the right to vote, but there was never any protection of that right. And also it violates the enforcement provisions of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So then there are many things that I could go into in terms of those violations, but I just wanted to set the tone in terms of whatever else we think about white privilege laws and white supremacy laws. They are, in fact, illegal according to the treaties that the United States has ratified, as well as the U.S. Constitution and its subsequent amendments. So then, as we talk now about these voter suppression laws, let me point out that voting has never been a permanent fixture or a feature of U.S. citizenship for African Americans. That is to say, ours are the only rights of anybody's rights that get to be reviewed and curtailed and amended and cut off every 25 years. That in itself should be challenged in court and any other forum. So then, as we speak of these white supremacy laws, these are some of the questions that we will be dealing with as we talk to our distinguished panelists. Our first panelist is Reverend David Billings. And Dr. Billings is the author of a book called Deep Denial: The Persistence of White Supremacy in the United States, History and Life. Reverend Billings is a community organizer and trainer with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and has been that for at least 4 decades. David, as we call him, or Dave, is a New York resident. Captain Reginald Lyles is a retired police captain, formerly on police forces in Berkeley, Oakland, Contra Costa County, and Marin County. He is a former aide to State Assemblyman Sandre Swanson in the state of California, in Sacramento, where those offices are. And he's also a former aide to Oakland Mayor Gene Kwan. Deacon Lyles is a theologian and a Sunday school instructor at the Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland, and I believe he currently lives in Novato, California. Ms. Diana Dunn is a former hospital administrator and medical technician. She is a community organizer and trainer with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, located in New Orleans, and she has been that for over 30 years. Dr. Michael Washington, who is graciously hosting this session here at Northern Kentucky University. Dr. Washington is a professor of history at Northern Kentucky University, where he has founded the Black Studies program during the mid-1980s. And during that time, he created the broadcast that we are now a part of, Afrocentricity, as a way of providing education to the public from an African-centered perspective. He has also created the definition of racism currently utilized by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. After they respond to the questions in the order in which I've just called them out, we will have responses by several of the people who are also on this line. I will not introduce them at this point. So the first question, David, would you identify examples of white privilege and white supremacy laws found in the current efforts by the Republican Party to suppress African American voting in the 2022 elections? Okay, we're not hearing David.
David, you should. Oh. Turn the mute on.
It's going back to the original intent of the U.S. Constitution, and that is to not only rob Black people of their right to vote, but if you go back to the original intent of the Constitution, Black people were not even yet classified as fully human. And so the reinstitution of white supremacist law, when I think of myself, regardless of what laws are passed around voter suppression or the right to vote or who can become a citizen, all of those are designed to benefit someone like myself, a white person, so that even when laws appear to go against my politics and things I speak out against, they're still benefiting me because white supremacy remains in place systemically in this country. So what used to be associated with groups like the Ku Klux Klan and other hate groups are now legitimized in the Congress of the United States. You know, we should not only be using masks possibly for COVID protection, but many in the U.S. Congress could put on hoods because they represent those who have challenged the democracy in this country since its very beginning. And again, every law that's passed, one could argue that it is designed to ensure white supremacy. When I think of where I live in the Bronx, for example, these co-op apartments, the boards are not subject to any review, are not required to be transparent in their decision making, and so can modulate who lives where, how many people of color, particularly Black people, live in any particular section of the Bronx. Now, it's never said because it's against the law now. This kind of housing legislation is illegal because it has been enshrined in state law, backed up by federal law. You know, there is no, when I present myself, or, you know, Marjorie Freeman, who is my spouse, presents herself before a bank, for example, to get a loan to buy a house, it is against the law to discriminate on the basis of race, but it's not against the law to enhance or to encourage disproportionately the benefits that come to people like us. What happens is that because of the systemic arrangement of white supremacy, we are much more likely to be able to share with our children and grandchildren an inheritance rather than an indebtedness. So these kind of systemic laws, which are now illegal, but are still very much in practice. The census, for example, which from the very beginning of the nation, as it counted who is legitimate and who is not, you know, did not count for many decades people of color, indigenous people, peoples from African nations now enslaved, peoples from the many countries of Asia. So this will set up a relationship to power that is carried over to the economics. And so this understanding of explains disparities. Why every system in this country, you understand, will have disparate outcomes because the beginnings of this country structured disparity, privilege to those of us called white, um, and various degrees of inhumanity to those of color. So anti-blackness and has been enshrined in this country. It's like a poison that has seeped into the nation and is a part of the bloodstream of the public. And there's a constant battle on the part of peoples of color, particularly Black people, to move towards equity. But it's always been moving towards equity, never achieving equity. Many years, and I don't have to tell a distinguished group like this how many years, that efforts have been made to bring about equity in the society, but without an understanding of racism and white supremacy, it's impossible to do it, regardless of intent. It's also impossible for those of us who have been categorized as white to ever be fully shed of the advantages that ensue to us because of that. So that's where, when I first heard you say, how can you describe some of the laws, I was at a loss to say, well, which ones aren't, even though their intent is, or their words point you towards equity, none of the results, not one of them, there are no systems that produce equity on the basis of race in this country. So that's my initial take on it.
Thank you, Brother Dave. And once again, I want to say that was the author of Deep Denial, The Persistence of White Supremacy in United States History and Life. Captain Lyles, would you please hold forth on that question? The question being, I'm asking you if you would identify examples of white privilege and white supremacy laws found in the current efforts by the Republican Party to suppress African American voting in the upcoming 2022 elections.
Well, thank you for asking. First of all, I agree with everything that David Billings said. Absolutely everything. Modern white privilege and supremacy laws, policies and procedures, all ramifications of them are designed and directed precisely at African Americans and others, but primarily at African Americans, because it's about space and place and how to control them in those spaces and places. These laws are always, absolutely in every instant, are designed to adversely affect African Americans. They're designed to disenfranchise. They're designed to steal property. They're designed to deny education, health care. They're designed to imprison, and they are designed to kill. And we see that over and over in our modern daily life. This is something that African Americans have adjusted to in a way that we survive in spite of it. But even though we survive in spite of it, it's like a psychological pressure that is, it defies oftentimes description. modern days examples are what I like to say is the police on duty homicides. This has a two-stage effect. It terrorizes Black people, and it emboldens and assures white folk that they will have everything that David Billingsley talked about. Excuse me, I'm sorry about that. So these rashes of killings that we see across the country because somebody has a tail light out, or because somebody didn't show their hand, or whatever, all the way up to the Supreme Court, reinforces that any way you get out of line or out of space, we can take your life. Jesus. That's my wife. I hope she's not in an accident. I'll just go on. It's designed to terrorize us, and we have been terrorized. No two ways about it. Our children are terrorized, our women are terrorized, and no matter what any man, even if they're my size, 6'4", 250 pounds, we are always scared to death. Why? Because any minute, anybody or any white woman can call any police officer on us and take our lives from us. And if they do that, anything that happens, very little happens to the homicide involved officer. And we've seen examples of that, unless you have the Derek Chauvin case, where you have this enormous, overwhelming evidence, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Witness after witness after witness within 4 feet of the homicide, screaming at Derek Chauvin, please stop doing this, filming the action, and we watched the slow death. And even in that case, you had folks coming up, defending Derek Chauvin, trying to give him the least amount tried to give him every bit of due process under the law, and try to give him the least amount of discipline or punishment that a certain act like that deserves. And then when we look into Derek Chauvin, we find out he had killed 3 other people prior to this homicide. And during that process, he was promoted to a field training officer. What does that mean? What is an FTO? An FTO is the person who trains new recruits that come into an agency and make them understand this is how we do business, and this is who we do the business to. So those are the things that we see. Now, these body cameras have proven what we Black folks have known for hundreds of years. It's irrefutable, but they cannot accept it. They cannot accept it, and they defend this action and this behavior, and they tell us these ridiculous excuses like it's only a few bad apples in the barrel. That's the most ridiculous statement ever. It's systemic. It is systemic. It goes all the way up to the governors and the elected officials, and to the presidency, and definitely the Supreme Court, that reinforced this kind of behavior toward whom? African Americans. For what purpose? To keep us terrorized, to keep us frightened, to keep us thinking that any minute, any way you get out of line, your life can be taken from you. Secondly, the truth is under assault. You know, they argued us under this last presidency, Donald Trump, that the truth is always questioned. That everything that we would see with evidence, proven evidence, visual, fingerprints, witness statements, all of that is to be questioned, cannot be proven as truth. You cannot even know the truth. And when you have evidence of the truth, they go in and now they've crossed the line, and they're just saying it didn't happen. Classic example is the January 6th insurrection. That wasn't an insurrection. Well, what was it if it wasn't an insurrection? We saw hundreds and hundreds of people storm the White House, break windows, grab uniformed police officers and take them down and beat them with American flags. No, that was a group of tourists coming to the White House on an excursion. They actually said that from the well of Congress. They actually said that. It's revolting. It's revolting. Can we get a commission together to study who was involved? Who planned this? Let me tell you, I've done civil disobedience responses 11 different times. I was the commander of them on the ground with mutual aid 11 different times in the city of Berkeley. 11 different times. You can't have an organization respond to a civil disobedience or not respond to a civil disobedience without pre-planning and agreements. So we have pre-planning agreements by whom? By the Capitol Police leadership, by elected officials, senators and congressmen, by the city of Washington, D.C. and their police department, by the U.S. Army and their non-response, by hospitals. Everybody has to understand we're going to stand down or we're going to gear up. And the fact that they all stood down, you got to have planning to do that.
Amen.
You got to have people to sit down and argue with you. This is what we do if this happens. This is what we do if this person calls. So for that to go off like it did, we need a national commission to look into it and let the chips fall where they may. But what did the senator say? No, we don't want to do that. It's unnecessary. It's totally unnecessary. That is the epitome of white supremacy. That's the epitome of disenfranchisement. The last point I want to bring up is this COVID-19, where over 600,000 people have died in these United States, and I believe that was part of this a structured event to bring about destabilization of the government. No question about it. The distribution of the vaccines were purposefully done, purposefully not distributed in the black and brown communities. I live in Marin County right now, and I'm not 75, but I'm close to it. I'm 71, and I hike with a group of people, a group of Jews. A guy told me, "Reg, have you gotten your vaccine yet?" I said, "No, I'm not old enough. They're not distributing to you. My age group's got to be 75. He said, "Here's a number. Make this call to this number." So they let me know that they've distributed the vaccine in its first distribution to service club members and etc. Therein lies a serious problem and a serious white supremacy example and how it adversely affects black folks. I think right now California is doing well with this vaccination, but black people were the very last ones to get the medicine. So those are my three examples of how we are being, in modern days, treated like Jim Crow era.